present yourself?
Yes. My name is Brzoska. I'm coming from Hamburg, Germany, where I am a retired professor at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy, but I'm also involved and still involved very much in research on the consequences of climate change within something called the Klimacampus Hamburg, where mostly natural scientists, but a few social scientists work together on studying climate change and its consequences.
My name is Moshe Gish. I'm from Natural Resource and Environmental.
I'm Zachary Kay, representing the public.
I'm Deborah Shmueli from Geography and Environmental Studies in Minerva.
I'm Noel Piot, and I'm retired from the Department of Geography.
I'm Marie McBride, and they are my advisors.
I'm Minerva.
And Minerva.
I'm Shomit Paz, head of the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. I'm a climate change researcher and focused.
My name is Colonel Reserve Ivan Milan, and my background is many years in flight testing in the Israeli Air Force and in risk management.
I'm David Vitale. I'm a software research fellow here at the University.
My name is Nelia Ronen, and I'm a student third year law faculty.
My name is Shai. I study for my second degree in environmental management.
Interesting, good.
I'm Eli Riddick. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Political Science, and I deal with energy politics.
My name is Stanley Rubenstein. I'm a PhD candidate in the management of environment and natural resources.
Going on anything with him.
No, but that's fine too.
I'm interested generally.
And I'm Amy Salzberger from the Law Faculty and the Director of the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law and Legislative Communication. It's really great to see so many new faces. Please come again.
And right now. You just introduce yourself, Professor.
What am I supposed to do?
Just your name.
My name?
Your name.
Oh,
you know
yeah.
it. No. Professor Aryeh Melnick.
But without
Department of Economics.
Professor Aryeh Melnick.
Michael?
Okay. Michael, yes, whatever. Yes, I'm going to speak about an ongoing project in which I'm involved, but and that's basically the title of the project. But before that, before discussing a little bit more about the project, I want to give you a little bit more of the background, why I'm pursuing this project and what is the, if you want, intellectual challenge related to that project. It has a lot to do with this, with a perception in the public, I don't know whether it's the same here, but at least in Germany and other countries where I go, that climate change will bring us more wars, that in the future we will see more of armed violence because of climate change, and this is just a selection of recent book titles. This idea culminated, in a sense, in 2007, when Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States, and the IPCC, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And here you have a politician and an activist, environmental activist, and an organization that is supposed to combine research on a specific topic, getting a peace prize. And as you can see from the justification of the chairman of the Nobel Committee, the idea that by informing about climate change and by trying to counteract climate change, these people in particular were participating and helping to prevent violence and conflict in the future. That was 2007. Since then, we have seen a lot of studies on this. and also a lot of studies that confirm this kind of assumption. Here's one example from a journal, Annual Review of Economics, by two American colleagues who, in their analysis, find increasing temperature and extreme rainfall deviation, more rainfall, to be unequally always connected to more violence, not only large-scale armed violence, but also violence. For instance, I have the example here of witch murder in the Tanzanian village. This group that's based in Berkeley has been very vocal in claiming that there is a strong academic scientific evidence that environmental consequences, or in this case even climate, weather-related consequences of climate change, are linked to more violence and including violent conflict. But there's also a strong counter move, if you want. Here's a selection of a number of statements from people. One's professor of, I think, actually, geography and intellectual history. Halvard Bohaug is a prominent researcher from Norway on conflict issues. This person, Watts from the University of Sussex, is another one who say this is wrong. This idea that climate change will lead to more violent conflict is not founded in research. There is very little evidence for it, and one should not use particularly the argument that it's climate change that is driving conflict to forget about the other factors which are more important, particularly politics, that it's mostly about politics, about groups claiming that they have the rights to use violence to bring forward their demands. That's driving conflict, and it's not the environment. This controversy, which you can see in a growing literature, this is the right-hand side, a number of articles, which is not so many, but still has been growing very much since 2007, that try to discuss this topic and try to find evidence. It is a very contentious strand of literature. Even as you can see from the lower thing in the right-hand corner, one of the researchers said, you know, we need peace in the study on climate change and conflict, because people are really getting very heated in these debates. We have contributed together with colleagues from Hamburg by trying to bring together all strands, because we are convinced that this discourse, this debate is still open, that there's evidence for the claim that climate change and related environmental consequences can drive conflict, but there's also counter evidence, and that it is not a given. As you can also see from the time chart, much of the discourse, the public discourse, occurred before a real strong academic work on this issue. It was really a discourse driven by political issues, I would argue, and it's not a surprise that most of the people who come and argue for this strong link, particularly before 2007 or in 2007, came from the United States, a country where a president at the time, George Bush, was in power, who was basically saying climate change is not a big issue. He was arguing against research on climate change and so forth, similar to the current president of the United States. So I think, and there's some academic work actually confirming that the bringing forward this idea that climate change is driving armed conflict has a lot to do with what one can call in political science language the securitization of the issue. That one says climate change is an issue for security. It's an issue that has to do with war and peace. And that one hopes that thereby it makes it more important, that it becomes an issue that gets more attention, and also that maybe one can convince other audiences to take this argument serious. In the United States, it was particularly military audiences, former and active military persons who also argued, yes, it is a security risk, and therefore we have to do something about climate change. Much of the political discourse in the United States changed with the Obama administration. This issue of violence became less of an argument when arguing for climate change mitigation. It is probably coming back again. I would assume that under the current president of the United States, it's coming back again. But research also has been very contentious on this issue. This can be seen also in the assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, those who don't know about it, is a large organization, if one wants, institution that brings together climate scientists, climatologists, and other scientists from a lot of countries in the world in order to work on assessments which reflect the common knowledge in the fields. It's not only, mostly though, about natural science phenomena. They also had a working group on consequences of climate change in various aspects, health and so forth. And one small group also looked at climate change and conflict. And they came to if you want, Solomonic wordings in the end. On the one hand, they say, yes, there is justifiable concern of increased risk of armed conflict, but they also say that the evidence is not really very strong, so that confidence statements about the effects are not possible. So they're trying to balance the views in the academic world, saying, yes, there's concern, yes, we have to take it seriously and study it, but we don't really have the evidence yet. Now, I think one of the main causes, of course, of this state of the literature in the field is the complexity of the links between climate change on the one hand and armed conflict, violent conflict on the other. There's so many intervening and other factors that play a role. We try to, in a study again coming from our group in Hamburg, to map this in a simplified way. This is a simplified way, and it's already, of course, extremely, interconnected. And you have links from the climate system to the natural resource endowment and resource dynamics. Then you have social issues. So it is hard to imagine that there's a simple connection, as, for instance, these American colleagues tried to argue, between changes in temperature and variability of precipitation and other effects that we would link with climate change with armed conflict. On the other hand, because of this high political interest and the importance of this in the public domain, this argument about climate change leading to more armed violence, I think, of course, and that's the starting point of the research, we need to do further work. Now, what we came up with is that we thought that, well, it is difficult to study this link between climate change and armed conflict, but maybe if we look at disasters, and particularly weather-related disasters, we find a stronger signal than when we look at climate change slow onset events. So things that happen over many years and where people may not feel the impact very immediately. So let's focus on weather-related disasters. And weather-related here is because, of course, climate change is something that happens over decades, but disasters are basically the weather, or it can be the weather. And weather-related, it doesn't really make a methodological sense to rule out other types of disasters because they also have major effects, particularly, of course, geophysical events such as earthquakes. But since we come from climate research, we limit it to weather-related. We banded together two people from the Hamburg group, Tobias Ide, who actually will be also in Israel in the spring. He's a guest of what's his first name? Fish handler at the Itai fish handler at the at Hebrew University. So he's more an expert. I'm not an expert at all on, for instance, water-related issues. He worked more on that issue, with two people from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research, who are more working on statistics and econometrical work. So they will do mostly the statistical and econometric work. They have already done a study on that, where they found a link between weather-related disasters and conflict onset by looking at a kind of a random model, where they argued that, well, if conflict just occurs randomly, then when we put in disasters in the model, that shouldn't change anything. But they found that actually within the 3 to 6 months after disasters, there were more violent conflict onsets than expected just from a random model. So that's what they are going to do again with more data. And they forgot to say that it was only true for ethnically fractionalized societies. So only where there was already a level of non-violent conflict before did they find this relationship, not in general. They'll do that again. They'll also do some other econometric analyses. They haven't decided yet what. We are lucky that we got recently data from Munich Re, which is one of the big insurance companies and has probably the best database on disasters. So they will work on that instead of what we have been doing so far, working on a public database, MDAT, which is not as detailed as Munich Re. Then Tobias Ide is mostly going to do a qualitative comparative analysis, trying to figure out factors, because that's what we're looking for. Why is it so that sometimes we do see and sometimes we don't see this link between weather-related disasters and climate change? What drives this relationship? What are the factors that shape it? And for that, the QCA seems to be a good methodological approach. And then I'm mostly doing the case studies, the others are doing also some case studies of larger disasters, arguing that really the signal from larger disasters should be the strongest. Although one can have doubts about that, but at least the idea there is there. And what I've lately focused on, because I found that particularly interesting and understudied, is the effect of humanitarian recovery assistance, both within the country and from outside of the country where the disaster occurred. I'll explain why I think that the study of humanitarian recovery assistance might be of particular interest. So that's the project we are doing. We're in the middle of it, and what I present here now is some preliminary results and things that we have come up with and ideas about that. Now, before I do that, I just want to give a little bit of background on disasters. Most of you probably are familiar with that, but for those who are not, there is another report from the IPCC, for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on disasters, which argues that climate change leads to changes in a number of elements that drive disasters. So therefore, we can expect climate change to have effects also on disasters, basically making them having more frequent and also more intense disasters. Not everywhere in the world. It distinguishes between regions in the world. I don't want to go into that. But we can also see that already in data. This is also Munich Re data in what they record as the number of events. This is including geophysical and geophysical events, not industrial events, but geophysical events also, but they're not changing very much. What is changing very much, you can see is blue, the hydrological events, what they call floods particularly, on also landslides to some effect, I think also in there. and also what they call meteorological events, which are tropical storms particularly. You can see also here then below that that Munich Re sees that the losses, which may be interesting in terms of the damage done to populations, of different groups of populations, and therefore then having an influence on armed conflicts in their reckoning have increased. Particularly, of course, often mentioned consequence of disasters, which may have an effect also on a violent conflict, is internal displacement, or broader than refugee movements. This is a source that only covers internal displacements because the data on disaster-driven refugees really isn't there. So internal displacement, of course, that's also sometimes not very reliable data. They show a great variability from year to year, mostly because of the floods and some factors of droughts that drive the disaster displacements. But one also can see that in general, the numbers are very high, at least, and that it's a major consequence of disasters. Okay, so what have we found out? And of course, we have mostly so far looked at the literature, done some case study work, preliminary case study work. As I said, the colleagues in Potsdam have done one run of their statistical model. So that's our current findings so far. The first item I think is rather important, that one has few cases where one can argue that environmental disasters, weather-related disasters, or geophysical, but we're mostly looking, as I said, or should look mostly at weather-related disasters, have rarely initiated armed conflict. So it's not a frequent phenomenon that after disasters we see new onsets of armed or violent conflicts. They are more often related. That's some people refute that, but that's my interpretation of the available evidence, that we see more cases of increases in violence. Depends a bit. We don't have very good statistics on dynamics of violence, so it's more coming from case study literature really than from the statistical or quantitative literature broadly. What I think comes out very clearly in the research is that ethnically divided societies, particularly where these ethnic divisions are related to power divisions, that they are more likely to see an increase in armed violence. Also with the onsets, I could argue that that's the case. We also see cases where disasters have facilitated an ending of armed conflicts. That's not very frequent, but it has happened. There is a study that looks at ceasefires and armistices and peace agreements and relates them to disasters, and finds that at least there's more cases one would expect than from random occurrence of peace agreements and ceasefires and so forth. There are some important examples, more related, the most important is related to the tsunami of 2005 in the Indian Ocean, where one could argue that the peace agreement that then came about in Aceh in Indonesia had a lot to do with the delivery of foreign assistance, and also the feeling of the fighting groups in Aceh that they were so depleted of resources that continuing to fight would not make sense. I also argue that in the paper that's sent around for the case of Mindanao, between some of the groups fighting for more autonomy, even independence of some parts of Indonesia, of the Philippines, I'm sorry, and the Philippine governments, where I argue at least that the peace agreement there was helped by the storms, and again, a loss of resources and means to fight, plus then the interest of getting international humanitarian assistance into the area, which would have been more difficult if fighting had continued at the level before. what is the problem with the literature, and that's a problem, I guess, that has to do with methodological issues, is that most of the literature focus on the immediate post-disaster time periods, when, of course, one can see a stronger signal, and there's not so many other factors that one has to bring into the analysis. But if you think it through, of course, it makes much sense to also expect conflict, maybe even more intense conflict, in the recovery phase, when people are possibly fighting about incoming resources, who gets what about in terms of recovery assistance. So in case studies, we do find that to some extent, that it's not only in the immediate post-disaster situation, or that one should not only look at the immediate post-disaster situation, but also at the recovery phase. more things here on what we find. One of the most mentioned causes for thinking that there should be a link between violence and preceding disasters is resources, that there should be a lack of resources. People lose resources, and that therefore they should fight over what is left. Particularly when it's linked also to migration, new people coming in, refugees coming in, displaced people coming in, and even less resources are there. Cases that come to mind to many people are droughts, for instance, whether people are driven away from their areas for farming or pasturage, and then are moving into other areas, and thereby reducing the assets and resources that are in the areas where they move on. But there's very few instances actually where one finds this to be the case in the literature. It's one of the most studied elements in this field, droughts and the consequences of droughts, particularly for pastoralists and farmers in drought-prone regions, particularly in the Sahel region, but also beyond. But at least from what I read in the literature, there's few instances where one really just finds this. Migration, yes, it's more often that I see it in the case study literature. Also, to some extent, we find it in the quantitative literature. But again, the links are not very strong, and it's not systematically linked. You cannot argue that always where there is a lot of migration, a lot of displacement, we see then an increase in conflict, leading even to violent conflict. What is not a new finding in general in the literature on environmental conflict and environment and violent conflict, but it's also a finding that's already there in the older literature that was there before climate change became such a topic, is that state capacity and political system are very important. That depends to a large extent, to what extent then this underlying structural factors come to a dynamic, lead to a dynamic escalation that might then end in violence, much depend on institutions that can regulate this, and state capacity, political system, how open it is. I mean, it relates a lot to the broader discussion on the effects of famines, for instance, where one has this famous argument from Amartya Sen and other that famines only occur in autocratic states and never in democracies and states where there's open media, and these kind of arguments. So I think they are there generally there. And then there is this argument about disaster management, humanitarian and recovery assistance, which, as I mentioned before, I think has not been really studied extensively, but comes up again and again in the cases. That because we have such a large humanitarian system nowadays, international humanitarian system, it may still be too small. People argue about it, whether it's sufficient or not, but it's there. It's a large business to some extent. And whenever there is a disaster in the world, of course, it springs into action. And sometimes it doesn't have much effect on the ground because, for instance, there's fighting and humanitarians can't reach an area, but very often it does bring resources, it does bring assets to disaster regions, and it does, of course, affect research endowments. It does affect the perceptions of people of what will happen to them. It does affect power relations, and it does affect to some extent, also then the conflict patterns in a region. I'll come back to that later on, but I think that's an interesting area I want to at least study more. And where I think also that maybe there are some links to the center here. Another thing that we are stressing, and I should try to put in the arrows here, in the study that we are doing, is to take a broader look at conflict than one finds mostly in the literature. That comes because I am coming different from the people in Potsdam, more from the conflict research side. And what I see in many of the studies that are done by people who more come from the environmental side is that they have a very simple view of how conflicts come about. That basically is, if there's scarcity, if people are feeling angry, then they'll fight. But that's not what I think we can learn if one looks at the results of conflict research. It's structure, yes. It is very important to what extent people are living in well-off circumstances, or whether they are in very dire circumstances. It's simply so, and we find a strong relation everywhere, quantitative and qualitative work, between poverty, between distributional issues, particular distributional issues linked to ethnic issues, and violence. That's there, yes, but it's not there all the time. It's very much, and that's why I bring in this perception element here. It's very much, of course, linked to perception. What do people make of poverty, of distributional issues, of ethnic divisions? How do they think about that? What are their concerns about that? What type of conflict do they have? It's a conflict about distribution of resources, it's a conflict about values. This is nothing new for people who study conflict, but for people who come from the environmental side, it's very often, particularly when they are then also doing quantitative work, it's not very convenient to think in these terms because it's hard to model it. It's hard to bring it into quantitative analysis, but it's very important. And so it's process. It takes an organization to fight. It takes resources, yes. One has, as an organization that wants to fight, one has to have the means to fight. But organization is important. Leadership is important. If there is no strong leader, very often, even in situations where there is a lot of contention, where the structural factors would say, well, there should be violent conflict, they're not there. Dynamics are important. Very often conflict starts with low-level, even non-violent action, maybe then because of government counteraction or the action of some other actor, bringing in violence and then escalating into then violent conflict. And violent conflict is the main interest we have, although of course we are very aware that lower levels of violence may be an indicator then of more intense level of violence, and that we should also look at that. So the interaction of this is what we want to look at. It's very difficult for, as I mentioned, the colleagues who are doing this quantitative work, because we don't have good, there's not really easy to access databases that say something about the process of conflict escalation or perceptions. That's very hard. It's more easy, or one can, even difficult, but one can try to, and that's, I think, where we are hopeful, bring it into the QCA by trying to bring in factors there that somehow reflect these issues. But there's it's much easier with the structural factors. Case studies, of course, we can bring it in, so that's where we bring it in. So in the paper, and that's something then which tries to combine the empirical analysis into something that in this paper that was sent around to those who got it before, called mechanism. I don't like the word mechanism very much. It's partly because in the context in which this was published, there were other studies that also looked at mechanisms and climate change, so they they asked me to also use that word, but I don't like it very much because for me, particularly in the politics of contention literature, it has a somewhat different meaning, which I like more. So anyways, but yes, I think one has to distinguish between these two possibilities. And of course, there's a large spectrum in between consequences of disasters. Disasters as conflict drivers because of competition over scarce assets and resources. I said it's not very often happening, but it is happening. And there are some examples. I can go into them in the discussion period. I don't want to speak too long. Failure of conflict management institutions. Sometimes we don't see effects because of climate change on violent conflict, because I would argue the institutions are very strong. And both China and India had very large floods in this decade, 2010, 2013, and nothing much happened. And that, I think, has to do a lot with the state structure, with the ability of the governments in both cases to then, not only through positive means, through support of the population, but also because they are, of course, repressing any kind of opposition that might then become political opposition. They're trying to prevent any kind of movement into conflict dynamics. So it's not, it doesn't mean that this is only, this kind of liberal kind of idea of conflict management. It's also using the full spectrum of means one has. So that's something I think that one has to consider. But we also have that, which has been times and again discussed also in the environmental field as environmental diplomacy and so forth, the idea that the environment can be a factor of peace. And here I think one can see also cases of disasters leading to, or at least contributing to, the escalation of conflict. So de-escalator is not a very good word for it. But this one case, which I find particularly interesting, of Mindanao in the Philippines, where I think that the frequent disasters in particularly Mindanao have contributed to a social process where people are seeing, or at least with the perception that the conflict that they have over religious issues, over politics, maybe should take second stance in view of the problems they have because of the frequent storms. That the cyclones are, and the need to prevent future large consequences of the cyclones that will come and may become even more frequent, should stop people from fighting and should really bring them together. So this kind of disaster is a social unifier. As I said, it has been discussed, particularly in sociological literature, a lot. Don't disaster bring people together? Don't we see that in many disasters, that people are really coming together? My younger son was in Mexico in September of last year when the earthquake there happened, and he sent back a lot of pictures of ordinary people helping to search in the rubble for victims. And all of a sudden, the whole city of Mexico City, which is not known to be a very friendly city, became a city of people cooperating. So doesn't that work also in situations where we have already organized groups, or where groups that might organize for violence are affected? And then I find something very interesting, which I call here transformation. I found that in the literature also, that disasters may speed up social transformations, that things that are happening in society at a slower pace may quicken because of disasters, because all of a sudden people need to make decisions about future life. Also because resources may be available all of a sudden that had not been available before. Examples that I discuss, I don't want to go into details, I can do that later in the paper that was sent around, are Myanmar after the big tsunami there, not tsunami, cyclone there, and Egypt. That's a strong hypothesis of here that has more to do with events happening somewhere else in the world, and then leading to increases in food prices in a number of Arab countries, including in Egypt. So to come to the second to final point, what are the factors that we so far are thinking are driving this nexus? And I bring the migration in here because it's such an important element also, but it's not necessarily always only linked to migration as a consequence of disaster. So the pre-disaster levels of social cohesion, ethnic conflict, exclusion, I think the evidence is fairly strong. So we want to look at that factor definitely and have a hunch that it is very important. Then we don't want to rule out the question of the availability of goods, services, revenues, this scarcity element, because even though I'm getting more and more skeptical about its immediate consequences, I think it has an element of truth in a lot of cases, particularly if one links it then to issues also of the capacity to organize violence. In a number of cases, I find that the lack of resources actually may inhibit the capacity to organize violence. I think it's a factor that needs further investigation, but it's not as simple as very often depicted in the literature. The distribution, and particularly then the perception of the distributions of losses and gains for organized groups, again, those groups that are maybe already, because of prior ethnic and social issues, organized around a certain issue in a certain way, that I think is important. Again, arguing that one has to think in terms of both local and displaced people and the dislocation that disasters may bring with them. Then the governance institution capabilities and capacities and credibilities of government institutions, particularly then, of course, with relevant groups that are having contentions and that may be organizing to use violence. And then the final point, which I think we want to look at, and at least I'm trying to argue with my colleagues that we should try to bring it also into our other elements, not only the case studies, is this management of humanitarian post-disaster recovery assistance. Because it brings different elements to conflicts available or already existing conflicts and conflicts that are still in the nudge. Relevant groups in disaster affected areas may see the organization of disaster management and humanitarian assistance in different lights. They may have different interests, who should get what in terms of external assistance, or also from governments in disaster affected regions. And to turn the issue around, I think it's also important how then those who bring humanitarian and post-disaster recovery are how knowledgeable they are about the conflicts that are in disaster affected regions. How much do they know? To what extent their assistance is affecting local conflict patterns. This is the final slide. Of course, humanitarian assistance, and I'm focusing now at humanitarian assistance, but I think it mostly affects also post-disaster recovery. They are arguing, and actually their foundation is like impartiality, neutrality, independence. So they are, of course, arguing, and if you look at something like the Sphere Handbook, which is like the main manual that many NGOs, but also UN organizations and others who are doing humanitarian assistance using, they're saying, oh, we try to assess the situation in such a way that the assistance that we bring is neutral, impartial, and independent from other interests. Of course, one can argue, and I think one can show that in a good number of cases, that this is a very difficult thing to do, very hard to do, and that it is often probably not working on the ground in that way. One particular example I want to bring in is the question of the cooperation with the military. Because in very many cases, of course, it is military forces who are at the forefront of disaster relief and even in many cases post-disaster management. It's because it's very often the only organization that has relevant assets, also because they are very often the only ones who can react very quickly. On the other hand, as you can see again here from the Sphere handbook, and as probably you've heard from a number of particularly NGOs, in areas where there is already open conflict or where the situation is close to open conflict, to cooperate very closely with the military, because it may then, particularly if it's national military, it affects independence, or in the view of certain groups that are involved in the conflict, it may make them allies of the one of the sides in the conflict. In Germany, there has been a big discussion about this in the case of Afghanistan. To what extent NGOs in the humanitarian and development assistance field should cooperate with the military. It's unavoidable in a sense. But it's a question then, and that's more, I'm not arguing here for or against, but from an analytical point of view, of course, it is interesting to study whether or not it does make a difference. To what extent a post-disaster delivery and also humanitarian assistance is then done by civilian or military organizations, and whether it's national or non-national military organizations, and broader, to what extent, because one can extend this argument, of course, also to state institutions. What about situations of internal armed conflict, where then state institutions are the organizations that bring humanitarian assistance and recovery and further on development assistance? How is that perceived by those who are fighting the government? And how does that affect then conflict patterns? I think, again, as to come back to the earlier slides, it depends very much, of course, on the circumstances. I don't see here a easy and simple pattern that we'll find in our research, but I do think it needs to be considered, and therefore I'm trying to focus on that. Okay, that's what it was, and I thank you for your attention.
Yeah, the floor is open.
Seems very complicated, and each region has its own politics and its own different conditions. How can you distill generalizations? Like, how can you come to conclusions that you can use in order to predict things in the future if every region has its different starting points?
Mm-hmm. Well, 2 points. First, there's various approaches to that, and I am not wedded to any kind of them, and I believe that mixing various methodological approaches is useful. So for quantitative people and people who work econometrically, they will look at probabilities. They will be interested in how much more in general conflict will we have because of climate change. So as I showed in this small side in the beginning, people who have worked with particularly the regression analysis, they will say, okay, if we find an increase in global temperature of 1 degree, if we find 15% more armed conflict, that's what we want to find out. That's it. So they're not interested in predicting any specific conflict, or even with respect to regions, although many people in the research focus on some region, Africa mostly, or Africa south of Sahara. That's another issue, and there's a lot of work done. They're happy with that. So it depends on what kind of prediction you want to make. You want to make a probabilistic prediction, and I'm happy if you can do that. Or do you want to actually then make predictions on single cases or even smaller regions and so forth? Where I do agree, it becomes much more difficult to do that. That's the first point. The second point is more about the politics of this, as you said. Yes, it is a very political issue how and where conflicts are emerging and the conflict escalation is occurring. And I do think that it is important, and that's why while I'm methodologically willing to accept a lot of approaches, including I myself worked on quantitative approaches, I do think that one has to be very careful in drawing any kind of conclusion that goes beyond stating, okay, I find a correlation between, for instance, temperature change and violence in certain level in certain region, because that to extrapolate that is, I think, then negating all other factors that are bringing it, and that's particularly negating politics. And there are cases in the past, and that's where I've been very wary, I must say, and about much of what came out of our branch of our research, not our group specifically, but in the whole research on these issues, into public media and also the politics, where then in the two examples I want to mention, the Darfur 2003 war and the recent Syria case, where then, in the public and among many politicians, it said, okay, Darfur, that was the first climate war. And Syria, again, arguing, okay, this is a climate war. And in a way, it exculpates the politics and the politicians who are really in charge or guilty, I would argue, about that a situation that, yes, was difficult in Darfur, where we had conflict between herders and pastoralists and various ethnic groups, or in Syria, where there was an authoritarian government and then a drought occurred. There was a drought, and it may have had environmental consequences. But to argue that the Darfur War of 2003 and the Syria War are climate wars, in my view, is irresponsible. And I mean, there's few in the academic field who have said that loudly, but any non-specialist who then reads studies like the ones I mentioned before, Burke and others, comes very easily to that conclusion that, if these people find a correlation between environmental change, and this environmental change we can see is, or we can argue is climate driven, and violence, then of course Darfur with this, drought and herders and pastoralist conflict, and Syria, where they had this big drought in 2007 and until 2010, it must be climate war. So that's why I agree that, why I think academically there are approaches where one can argue about probabilistic things. One has to be very clear that this is not a prediction about the future, that the future is mostly shaped by other things. And part of the idea of this research also is to hopefully show that one can influence that by strengthening a conflict resolution mechanism, by maybe organizing humanitarian assistance somewhat different, or by at least having the humanitarian community think more about what they are doing in conflicts. I mean, they're already doing that, but helping them also or showing that it's also important from this angle that one can then affect to some extent the future course of what climate change brings in terms of violence.
Two comments. The first one is, what is the linkage
in this lecture, and let's say the top title of the course here, namely conditions, the rule of law under extreme conditions. I haven't seen anything in the paper that specifies any changes in the change of the rule regime in that countries that you have mentioned in your paper. This is the first question. The second one, I have a methodology question. I think that we are mixing causal analysis and correlation analysis in this paper, because from the perspective of correlation, it's not a simple two-variable equation. It's a multivariable equation. We have weather conditions, climate change, and then we have multi-variables, social variables, sociological variables, political variables intervening. So to come and to do a simple correlation between A and B without looking at the intervening variables seems to me wrong. This is from a correlation point of view. From a causal point of view, then we can speak about conflicts that has a variety of reasons on a net back basis. The ultimate result is something that has to do with an armed conflict. But if you are pinpointing to the reasons, one of them, not the only one, not the dominant one of them can be also weather conditions. So what is the conclusion here? I really don't understand the conclusion here.
Okay. The first question actually is why I'm here, because I'm interested in seeing links. I fully agree with you that there are no links in the paper that I sent around, but I'm interested and have already learned to some extent, how then legal systems, for instance, in disaster management, might affect what I here am studying in terms of delivery of humanitarian assistance, or the question of which actors are involved in humanitarian assistance just release. Does that make a difference in legal terms or in terms of actual delivery and then the consequences for conflict? So the idea for me coming here was really to learn more about the thing I don't know anything about, that is this kind of, rule of law under extreme conditions. It's potentially something that might help, shape also our research here. That's the idea about it. The second, yes, I think you're putting your finger on a very important point, but of course it's a general point, as you also outlined. I mean, it's a question that time and again we are looking at shortcuts to establish causality by investigating correlations. And I'm by training first, I was an economist, and then I studied political science. Of course, economists, and I think you are economists, have developed very intricate methods of trying to study correlations and thereby arguing and hoping, whatever, that causal analysis actually results. Some of them are doing it by trying to capture all the other factors in a very simple way, by just saying, okay, we make a fixed effects analysis and we try to bring all of these other things into one big basket.
I know, I'm an economist.
You're an economist, okay.
I know.
Yeah, so they're trying to do this.
The problem is that the variables in this multi-equation is, context dependent. So it's from a theoretical point of view to take and to have a correlate. It reminds me that there is a high frequency of what?
Lung
cancer,
lung
cancer, and smoking.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, what is the dependent variable and what is the independent variable? The independent variable is smoking. The ultimate result is, a lung cancer. Now, if you take it on the opposite, you can also come to very, not sensible results that lung cancer is the reason for smoking frequency, high smoking frequency. And now this by itself, it reminds me of this research. Sorry, because these are two, very remote variables, and a very remote intervening variables that we have to take into consideration that are by themselves, they are, context dependent. So why now?
I would disagree.
And the idea, just a moment, and the idea is to predict, to say that if this and this will occur, then we have this and this result. This is the idea behind the research, I think. Otherwise, it's not, practical. So,
well, I disagree with the example, because one always has to bring, of course, some kind of theoretical or quasi-theoretical thinking into the idea that armed conflict is driving the environment and temperature is obviously nonsense.
Of course.
So in this case, inverse relationships don't say.
Of course, but
the other example, of course, the
By
other
the
point
way,
is
it's
more.
not, if as a result of an armed conflict you destroy the whole rainforests, this causes climate change.
Okay,
So
but it
there is
hasn't. Okay, but in terms of
variables,
armed conflict that we can study, and we can only study the past, we haven't had a conflict that on the larger scale has influenced the climate. Not even. You could argue maybe about precipitation in some cases, but okay, at least it is much more likely that armed conflict is driven by environmental change than the other. So, and we can only study the past. So maybe in the future it's different. But for instance, nuclear war would of course make it completely different. So this group at Berkeley, Berg and others, they are very much working with fixed effects models, and they are arguing, and we have had a big controversy about that. They are arguing basically that a fixed effects model, if you have each individual case as one variable, and you have only the climate signal as the only independent variable, then the fixed effects should take care of all the other variables. I don't agree with that, but it's a question, and I'm not a statistician, but for me it doesn't make sense. My colleagues from statistics in Hamburg, they are some of them are arguing with this group. They're saying yes, if you have a fixed effect model that way, it actually you can isolate a single factor. All the omitted variables, no omitted variable basis issue, because it's all the fixed effect. I think if there is a systematic other factor, also the fixed effects model would have problems. Would be my view on it. But okay, we can argue about that. But I fully agree with that. It's not causality. We can establish causality. It's an empty, or not an empty. It's a closed thing. We have input and output, and we don't know what happens in between. And of course, it's very important. That's the idea of this work also, to study in between and look at potential causal change and mechanisms that are working. But it's very, very difficult. I agree. And one can test one variable after the other with maybe a kind of fixed effects model. I'm not sure. One can use these other methods that these colleagues from Potsdam have used. But I agree, it's only correlation. It's not causality. And I'm not sure that we'll ever be able to predict anything, as I mentioned before. I'm also very wary about predictions. But maybe we can come up at more taxonomic, and that's where we are now. We're doing taxonomies. We're trying to classify which factors are driving dynamics in which direction. Where do we find cases, and what kind of conditions are there in certain combinations of factors? That's what the QCA basically is about.
That would seem much more salient than any predictive factor. And in the paper, that comes out pretty strongly. Looking to identify maybe turning points, maybe sticking points, but less prediction.
Let me come in, because it's a follow-up question on Zachariah, actually. We're very glad that you are here. also from our point of view, because we don't deal with climate change, and we didn't think that climate change is an interesting phenomena for the rule of law under extreme conditions. Therefore, our interaction is very, very fruitful. But I have a problem with the four, basic notions. First of all, climate change, leading to disasters, leading to conflict, and the last station in the train is the rule of law under extreme conditions. So from a kind of a very, very intuitive reaction, we don't consider climate change as extreme condition. Why? Because from the point of view of the rule of law, for an extreme condition to be an extreme condition affecting the rule of law, it should be imminent and to some degree unpredictable. If something is predictable, you can prepare in advance, and then you don't have to have a switch in the rule of law. If something is not imminent, okay, climate change is a long process, then there is no reason for a change in the rule of law. If something is predictable and imminent, you also can prepare in advance and take out of the drawer the necessary steps that the law requires, are required and entrenched by law, and deal with it. So from intuitive point, climate change is not a reason for concern from the rule of law under extreme conditions. But of course, if you go through the stages, climate change brings to a disaster, brings to a conflict, and disaster and conflict are imminent and unpredictable, then of course there is a connection between climate change. But I have a problem with all the links between these stations, because climate changes by definition. Okay? No year is exactly identical to its previous year. No moment, that's also from philosophically, there is no such thing as normality. So what makes climate change a factor that causes conflict, disaster, and maybe a need to declare emergency? From a scientific point of view, what will be the magnitude or pace of climate change? This is one conceptual problem. Then, of course, to point to the connection between climate change and disaster is also depends, as you say, on society, the regular rule of law, its system of government, and so forth. We don't do prediction, but we do prescription. Okay? We want to portray the ideal polity with the ideal rule of law that will bring the chances for a conflict, disaster, or something imminent and unpredictable to minimum. So how can we go through these links with in mind thinking about the response or the preparation or the prescription of the rule of law, the law or the political system, the institutional system, that will bring to a minimal the chances that climate change will cause such conflict, disaster, and so forth.
Good question, difficult answer. On the first link, I'm not an expert. I can't claim to be an expert. I'm just relying on what my colleagues and maybe others in the room who know more about this are saying about the consequences of climate change for extreme weather events. That they are arguing that it is, and IPCC's FRAX report says it very clearly, that they are expecting more extreme weather events and more violent extreme weather events. And then when we talk to people in the insurance business, like Munich Re people, they say, okay, we're already seeing that. Maybe it's not climate change they are seeing, because climate is long term, as you say, but at least we see this increase, and it's for us pretty plausible that it has to do with this long-term change in temperature. So yes, I'm starting from that point and not questioning it, because I'm not an expert on this. The other thing is, what I can say, if that is true, and if we can rely on this prediction of more and more extreme disasters, then of course studying conditions of extreme conditions becomes a more urgent issue. And that's as far as I can argue, I think at the moment, that it becomes a more urgent issue, that one needs to think more about what can we do about disaster preparedness. Okay, that would not be extreme conditions, but also what happens if preparedness was it. Because yes, and you come back to your point, also the climatologists who are working basically with models. Okay, sometimes statistical, but mostly they are claiming positive loss going into their model. So they cannot predict where the next cyclone will be. Maybe a couple of days before, but they cannot say now. They can say the probability that the Philippines will have more and severe cyclones, or that the number of hurricanes in the Caribbean is increasing by so and so much percent. But they cannot say which year, which island will be affected. So that's the level of, preparedness, but also then studying what kind of instruments are there, and where I see the closest link in a sense, because I've seen here and I've talked to Deborah about it and Karl about the disaster management, is the disaster management. How is disaster management organized? What kind of instruments are there? Okay, again, it's prepared, but situation then comes there. Which organization is taking which role? I think that's where then the closest I can see at the moment links with the research here.
In a way, I will continue the methodological argument. One insight I got from your lecture is has concern to the time access. Most of the studies we are talking about are short-term studies. And it seems to me that for full understanding of the process of, for instance, of recovery after disaster, you need almost anthropological studies that will stay long after the disaster, just in for one reason, to better understand the process of recovery and perhaps be again indexed with the beginning of the disaster in order to get a full picture of one disaster. It will give us some good points about future research. It's not done. I know it's not done. Shortage of money, etc., etc. When you tell funding organization that you need a budget for 10 years, they probably will kill you. But from the point of view and of understanding, I think these long-range studies are necessary, almost a must, in order not to get probability, get a good picture of what are all the elements of therapies.
I agree. And I try to get students to, not do a real anthropological studies, but at least to do test studies on long-term effects of disasters. And it's very interesting. Sometimes things only happen much later. On the other hand, of course, then to delineate and to argue that it was the disaster that did this, it becomes very difficult. So you get all kinds of, again, you can't really establish causality. You can't just say, okay, it was a factor. In the Darfur case, I would argue, yes, it was a factor, certainly, that there was droughts before. But you have population growth, you have the politics of peace agreement in the south of Sudan. You have escalation of local conflict over water and land, and you have the intervention of the international community who then tries to push the government in Khartoum to certain things, and they don't want to do that. And then so it is getting very difficult then to argue, oh, So we have this climate signal, or this weatherly signal, weather signal in the beginning.
Case, we're going a long way. That's actually. Is us.
I would like to highlight another aspect of this issue on the tactical level. And sometimes there is a very unstable interaction between the disasters and the conflict. Give me one example here in Israel. One of the most frequent disaster in Israel is very big forest fire, especially here in America. And in this case, if we are in, as you know, in an asymmetric conflict for the land, and there is already such kind of disaster like a big forest fire approaching the city of Haifa, then some people take advantage, and it seems that the weather condition is very, very suitable for the fire. It's hot, there is a wind, and then if you just imagine here and there, there is an immediate unstable situation where you want to increase the size of the disaster. And the other one is the disaster is crazy, and it's more easy to against bigger nations. So it's an unstable situation, very difficult for all kind of asymmetry.
But one can argue that the big disaster also causes afterwards, which is not a mega disaster, causes afterwards rethinking, which prevents disaster for the next 50 years, and then, in a long span of time, the disaster was actually desirable. Yeah.
Oh, it's me? Oh.
Two short questions. One, you focused on weather-related disasters, but I didn't see any real methodological or theoretical reason why to take out other natural disasters like earthquakes. In terms of it doesn't cause weather-related disasters, don't cause any a different type of damage to the state than an earthquake, or at least they didn't notice any one of those. And dropping earthquakes and other natural disasters out of your large N, I think damages it, because the more natural disasters you have, the better your survey is, and really what you're saying is that the disaster leads to either more conflicts or less, and then the climate change can create more disasters. So it doesn't matter if you can add earthquakes and it won't hurt your arguments. That's one. The second is you focused all your case studies were intrastate armed violence. I've noticed, not interstate, not between states. But sometimes natural disasters don't really care what your borders are. Are there any case studies where a natural disaster hit a few states and that actually created more cooperation between them in order to deal with the disaster, or actually escalated violence between them? For instance, the drought creates migration to another country, and that creates a violence between the two countries.
Cross-border disasters.
Yeah, okay. First question, yes, I agree. It would make methodological, particularly for the people who quantitatively would probably use for corridor field when we do that. They think we do it. Just contemplate are not that. On the other hand, of course, one can look at different types of disasters also. Now with unique data, we can have so many events that we can actually look for. There may be differences between storms and floods. Because they do have some differences. But it's simply because, I mean, you mentioned funding. This comes from climate funding, so we have to always say we're doing climate change research. And say we're doing that research. So it's why focus on that. But as you can see in the paper also, I mean, the most striking example of all, that's quoted all over the place, of course, is the tsunami in 2005. Affected tsunami, which. So, on the second issue, yes,
I mean, first one is to say there are rather few cases of international law in the period we look at. So it's just a question of the amount of cases we have of interesting armed conflict. So, but there are some cases, people have quoted, actually not immediate disaster related. There's this famous football war in 1954, between Honduras and El Salvador, which had to do a lot to do with had a lot to do with land use issues and because of environmental degradation between up and down. So, but again, there was a lot of politics. There was a lot of politics involved. Some people using this as a practical thing to then militarize the country. There is a certain literature, as I mentioned before, on disaster diplomacy. One of the cases that is famous in that, I know it's again not other related, is about a series of disasters actually in Turkey in the 1990s, I think it was, where then the Greek government, the Greek government then offered support for the Turks, and that initiated a whole process of reconciliation between the Greeks and the Turks. So, but these are not cross-border disasters. There's some other examples. There's a guy who has written, who has written a book about disaster diplomacy, focusing on international events.
Homer Dixon.
Homer Dixon, yeah. And so there are cases. There's this idea of the environment bringing peace and stability, but also including the disaster. Cross-border, there's one case that is fairly often also for the literature between India and Bangladesh. Bangladesh, of course, is seen as a country likely to be most affected, one of the most affected countries of climate change because of increased flooding. But we have had cases of large-scale flooding, also including the monsoon rains in parts of India, Assam, and the other south, some states in India, and then also migration. We have for a long time had Chittagong area in Chittagong Hills, and there has been conflict on and off in the Chittagong Hill Tract at home, and they have to do with disasters to that extent that migration movements and resource issues are particularly important post disaster. So there are some cases, but I haven't.
I would add two things. International rivers, when they are shared by a few countries, often lead to conflicts especially when there is a drought or climate changes. But we did not find that people really fight over water, but we found out a tendency to find a peaceful solution in almost all the international cases. And the other case, the Sahel, with the drought there, all the countries there are similar, their economy and development. So there is no use fighting with the neighbor that is exactly in the same trouble you are. So this is why there are no international conflicts in the same, because all the countries are subjected to forces.
Practically speaking, I think that if you take the case studies that you've mentioned in your article and try to gather more information regarding the possible change of the rule of law in those countries, when it happens, cyclone or whatever, then it makes for me more. There is reasoning how we can link between climate changes and maybe a change in the rule of law. What happened to the institutions
in those countries, if it occurs, then it can give us, yes, it can give us some more, I would say, insight in these cases that is more interesting, I think, than this paper, to see if there is a possible linkage between weather condition changes and any influence on the rule of law in these countries. If it if it was for a short time, if it was for a long time, what really happens, etc., etc. Maybe there is information about it.
I think it's very ambitious, interesting, ambitious. I think one case I would really like to look at, and or maybe have a student do it more intensely, is that of Myanmar after Nargis in 2008, because I think that's very intricate but very interesting. Nargis was this large cyclone that had a lot of victims, the largest in terms of victims disaster event of the last since 2000. So, and of course, first the government reacted by really strong measures, no rule of law at all, but just trying to seal off the area and not let humanitarian organizations from the outside into the country because they were afraid that these would destabilize the government.
In all the cases?
In Nargis, this is Nargis since 2008 in Myanmar. So, but then the government started to reconsider, and also because of international pressure, and started to change.
Also because their resources were severely limited.
Yes.
So I think that's
right.
a major part.
So I think that would be an interesting case to look at under that perspective. How did that affect the rule of law? It's still, of course, it's still not. We see it recently. A country that is, always doing things right, but there has been major changes. At least for me, from my preliminary knowledge, it seems that the Nargis and the consequences of Nargis, not the disaster itself so much, but how the international community reacted, how China reacted, also internally, how various groups reacted, led to transformation of the society and also the legal regime.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, the title was if climate change can lead to violent conflict. I think that in the article, besides a couple of lines about the heat wave in Europe, all the places that you talked about were already in some level of conflict, I think. So ask if, I don't, so it's weird for me that this is like the study cases. You know what I mean? Like, if there were already conflicts over there, so weird to ask if climate change over there or some disasters can lead to this violent conflict.
Well, as I said before, I mean the violent conflicts are there because we have good data on that, and particularly the colleagues who work on the quantitative side have difficulties to work with other forms of violence because the data simply isn't as good. But I mean, I think from my point of view, it is not really logical to focus on this kind of armed conflict because a lot of escalation goes up and down, and conflict can be officially in terms of the data sources an armed conflict of 1 year, and now the next year simply because the level of violence is because they have quantitative definitions. And social unrest and so forth, I think also very important if they are then linked to disasters. That is also in terms of extreme events. Why only armed conflict? It doesn't really make sense for my, but it's data driven for the time being. And I do think that it's also, that's the other part of the answer, it would be limiting to look only at one from the beginning. But very often, because we have this conflict dynamics, I mean, which part of the world doesn't have conflict? I mean, there's conflict all over the place. Conflict in terms of differences of interest, differences of position, differences, whatever, how you define it sociologically. The problem, my view, starts when it gets violent, when violence gets involved. Conflict all over the place. But the escalation process is very important. So I want to study also intensification of whatever data I can get on violence, whether it's armed violence. So if a war is like the Somali case, there always has been fighting since 1992, but on different levels. So it's interesting also to look at to what extent did the big droughts in 2011 or earlier drought change the pattern of fighting and the intensity of fighting, because that's also affecting people in migration and displacement and so forth. So I don't want to only look at one side.
But then yes, probably before one examines climate change and conflict, first of all, you have to examine if there is any correlation between climate and conflict, static climate, which is kind of a baseline for the research. And if you want to measure conflict, or question what you want to measure, but if you want to measure violence, for example, then it's not only groups, terror, it's also crime that should be incorporated. So you could take some kind of, the number of fatalities, but not natural deaths in a country, studied along the years in correlation with either climate or climate change. Probably climate change also is not homogeneous everywhere in the world. So
Peter Glick did that for the water sources.
Okay, I think I really resist this, what I'm going to say. I think that from the perspective of the rule of law, if country is reluctant to accept international assistance, maybe it violates the humanitarian rule of law. I mean, humanitarian law.
no, but this is
a
separate question.
It's a separate question. It's a nice thought.
It's a nice
thought.
But it's not to violate the humanitarian law. No.
Humanitarian law is a nice suggestion. It's not hard law.
It's not law.
Not an obligation.
It's not even
It's not an
possible.
obligation.
No.
Except. David.
Oh, thanks. My question actually, picking up on that relationship between climate change and conflict, I'm just wondering the extent to which work has been done or can be done on maybe some sort of intermediary between the two. Because you mentioned quite well in your paper all the different factors, but perhaps something like, I'm thinking something like hostility. So whether or not we can measure kind of the relationship between climate change and increased hostility, and then that hostility may lead to conflict or may not lead to conflict, depending on the various factors that you mentioned. I'm just wondering, kind of.
Well, I guess it's more complicated. It's equally complicated. But the suggestion in general is good, and other colleagues are doing that, and maybe we should also do that. For instance, the level of income and resources. People are studying water is one. So, instead of arguing, okay, we first have to have disaster and then the less resources, we might not study any kind of situation where there is a resource crisis, and whether that then affects conflict. And some research has been done on that. And it's not easy because again, resource scarcity, and I think that's what I tried to bring out with this kind of simple model. Resource scarcity can lead actually to more peace. People are arguing that in the Sahel, there was a recent study that found that in the Sahel, as was mentioned before, internal warfare over a period of time, which I now forget, had decreased with scarcity. They didn't look at drought, they looked at scarcity. And the argument was that people couldn't simply find the time and resources to fight. So you need some kind of extra resources to be able to organize violence. So if all people are just in refugee camps, getting more difficult. So
that's why I was thinking, because for example, if climate change or drought were leading to hostility, but then people couldn't get the resources, it may be that the as you mentioned, the resource shortages can actually not lead to actual full-blown conflict, depending on how you're measuring it, but could lead to kind of a precursor. And so it's it would give us some insight into how we can stop kind of that hostility to lead into full-blown conflict kind of before, and that's where kind of law.
It's very hard to study.
No, definitely.
It's probably very hard to study. You need to have perception analysis.
Yeah.
It's very hard.
That's why I was just curious whether or not you think it could be measured or has been measured. But.
Yes. I think rather than looking at the problem as climate driving wars, I think it's climate change driving wars. I think it's helpful to look at it as climate change exacerbates the situation, the existing situations. It's more or less parallel to the connection between climate change and weather. I mean, as you pointed out, there are storms, but recently we've seen much stronger storms, which is attributed to climate change, which makes a 1 in 100 year storm come every 10 years instead. Because I think you'll chase your tail trying to say, okay, I found the ultimate correlation and causality that climate change is causing wars.
No, I'm not looking for that, but I'm actually a step before that, what you suggest. And I think the literature in general is a step before that. Namely, while there is a scientific almost consensus that climate change will lead to more and more extreme weather events, there is no consensus that climate change will lead to more conflict.
No, but it could exacerbate it, make it worse.
Possibly, but it's not. I would really doubt that, because I think that the evidence is not really there. That it may be, and there's a logic. I mean, there's a lot of logic behind this argument, but the empirical evidence isn't really strong yet. And maybe we find, maybe it's because we haven't found the evidence. I would think that somebody argued about, okay, the long term, but in case studies, I find it, there's almost consensus, rather convincing when people argue about periods in the Little Ice Age in the 11th and 16th century, both for Europe and China, about an increase in warfare. In Europe, the data isn't very good, but all the studies that we have indicate that the cooling that happened during that period in the Northern Hemisphere was linked to more warfare. Because people were basically living off agriculture. As it gets cooler, you have a harder time to harvest enough in that part of the world. And the state deteriorates because of order and rule of law, which kind of was there, deteriorates because there's not enough resources to rule the people. So it makes much sense to argue a breakdown of societies, less resources from farming, more fighting over it.
By the way, this was the period which originates the concept of emergency from the
Okay.
point of view.
Okay.
The state of siege. France was in response to the weather problems in the starting the 11th century. It's quite interesting.
So that I find logical, and we have the empirical evidence. But now we're talking about warming, so you have to argue about what does it change if things get warmer? Okay, also the precipitation patterns, the rain patterns change.
Sea level rise.
Sea level rise we have. Other effects, precipitation and water and so forth. But how does that then lead to lower income? I mean, it has to lead to net lower income. It's not only that leads to lower income, but at the same time, our global income is growing very much. It doesn't really matter that we have to spend more money on maybe higher seawalls and so on. If we can pay for that easily, so it has to have, in order to have an effect on, if that is a cause of conflict, poverty, distribution, but it has to have an effect that cancels out the other effects that are going in the opposite direction. So it's not, I would argue, it's not as clear-cut a prediction, or prediction is wrong word, clear-cut what I would accept as a clear-cut result of the research that has been done in the last 10, 15 years, that there is a link between climate change, that we will see more, that we'll see more violent conflict because of climate change. Maybe so. A good theoretical assumption at the IPCC.
You may not see more, but they may be more violent.
Maybe they're more violent, yeah, but still that's also not a given. It's not, and we can't really base it on strong empirical evidence. It is a possibility, but it's not, the evidence isn't there. And it's maybe because we haven't found the right methods to assess the evidence. Maybe it's not good enough, or some people are smart, like the Berkeley people, we're just dumb and don't find it and don't convince. One may not be there, but that's why I think more research is necessary.
And I had a comment on the connection between climate change and the rule of law. I don't exactly know what you mean by the rule of law. But let's take the legal aspects of these things. And you said it has to be imminent. It's not imminent, we don't have to worry about it.
Oh, we have time to prepare for it in advance, and then we don't have to have a shift.
It depends how you define imminent. For instance, it's already happened that some outer banks of the eastern coast of the United States, which used to be above the water or below the water. Who owns the land? What happens to the rights?
It's something that we already decide independently. No need to any extreme legal method.
Because why? If the land is above the water, I own the land.
Because if you have time to legislate, then you create a
But it's already happened.
But it's not something danger that will affect.
Within the next 10 or 20 years,
Yeah, 10 or 20 years.
Part of Miami Beach may be underwater. But you can't wait till the waters come up before
No, but you can know it, you know it, and you can prepare for it. So,
only if you start.
Well, there's another. I mean, I agree with Will first, but there's an argument actually about whether climate, this is going away from my topic, but whether climate change would justify extreme measures, such as forcing countries to some. If they don't do it. But there's a link between climate change.
but there is another point here which might be interesting, and we have, you know, the main debate about climate. Who is the cause of climate change? Whether it's nature or man-made. And as you know, discussed it the day before, from a psychological behavioral effects, also policy and law. There is a big difference whether this is, you know, a natural disaster, if it's semantic being, or man-made, because then you can blame someone, and this is, of course, a cause for conflict, violence, etc. So this is something that, you know, we cannot judge whether climate change is man-made or nature, but
Why can't we judge?
But we can measure perception, whether perception of people changes, whether they think it's man-made or cause and action.
I'll give you a better example.
Al Gore, by the way, I met him.
Man-made.
I met Al Gore, and his perception of climate change is almost logical.
Yes.
Which is very difficult to have any common ground for discussion or debate.
I'll give you an example. There's talk of bringing large lawsuits against the oil companies, because in their prospectus, they put in their reserves and they value them. And we're talking about the value 50 and 100 years from now. They value them and they raise money today.
It's a must.
Those
It's a
values.
must. It's a must to put it in perspective.
Of course, it's a must.
It's a must.
But they're overvalued. Because
I don't know if it's overvalued. It's a must. I can tell you, I'm an expert on this. It's a must. You have to put it in the prospectus and evaluate it, and it's also in the financial reports.
Of course, but if nobody's going to be buying petroleum products and fossil fuels in 50 or 60 years, it's overvalued.
But it's a must.
I understand that, but you could value it with less money.
Okay. No, you don't want to put it in less value.
You don't want to, but maybe you have to.
Thank you very much.
Then the stocks will